and it sounds just like a song. I want your belly and that summer feeling. I don't know if I could ever go without watermelon sugar high, 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 watermelon sugar high. I just wanna taste it. I just wanna taste it. Watermelon sugar high. I just wanna taste it. I just wanna taste it. Watermelon sugar high.
But even with nothing on, bet I made you look. I made you look. I'll make you double take soon as I walk away. Call up your chiropractor just in case your neck break. Ooh, tell me what you gonna do? Ooh. 'Cause I'm about to make a scene, double up that sunscreen. I'm about to turn the heat up, gonna make your glasses steam. Ooh, tell me what you gonna do? Ooh. When I do my walk, I can guarantee your job will.
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Ladies, if you feel me, this your I could have my Gucci on. I could wear my Louis Vuitton. But even with nothing on, bet I made you look. I made you look. Yeah, I look good in my Versace dress. But I'm hotter when my morning hair's a mess. 'Cause even with my hoodie on, bet I made you look. I made you look. And once you get a taste, you'll never be the same. This ain't that ordinary, this that 14 karat cake. Ooh, tell me what you gonna do? Ooh, when I do my walk, I can guarantee your job will drop. 'Cause they don't make a lot of what I got.
Please welcome back to the stage Meg Szabo, Senior Editor for Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch. I hope you enjoyed the facilitated networking and the view up there on the 28th floor. We're so happy to have you back here. Just a couple of quick reminders. If you'd like to submit questions for our speakers, you can use that QR code behind me. The Wi-Fi is on the back of your badge. And you can also engage with us on social media using the hashtag SustainableBizSummit. Now we turn to a conversation on building a business that has purpose at its core. Please join me in welcoming Chobani founder and CEO Hamdi Ulukaya with Bloomberg's Carol Massar.
Hi, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well. You know, we often talk with leaders, not here at Bloomberg Live, but some leaders who talk about doing good, and then there are those who actually follow through and do it. And this is a true example of someone who is changing the world and thinking about the community at large and thinking about sustainable on so many different levels. So Hamdi, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you.
And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but we are Bloomberg. We play a drinking game, like every time we say the Fed, it's like a shot of something, usually water because we're at work. Business environment, how do you think about it right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange times. It's so good to be here with you, and I'm honored. It's strange times. You know, I listen to Bloomberg and watch all the newses and all that places, and then there's the reality on the floor.
Right.
There's the reality on the factory floor and stores and people's behavior. I have a very optimistic view. I think we have passed the time that we were really worried about things can get really, really bad, especially on that supply chain issue times.
Yeah.
I was very worried. I think that's kind of milding. That's kind of coming down to the right place. I was very worried about this price hike was going to go really high, especially on food.
Right.
And the reality of people affording food, being able to have an access to food, especially children, it was coming to a place how much more this price is going to go up. And in there, I became a little loud, and I said, well, the companies are doing a little bit more than what the inflation is asking for. Is this an opportunistic time that people are taking advantage of?
Do you think it was?
It was a little bit there.
Yeah.
It was a little bit there. And I think it came down now, and it's just leveled, and I think it will find a place. But you saw some capitalistic, approach on the places like, oh, this is our time to be able to bring our prices to a place where we can have the margins and all that kind of stuff. There's that attitude. In the long run, that doesn't work. I think we were the first one ever that we went to our retail partners and we said, in certain categories that we have, we're going to reduce the price. And they were like shocked. And basically, well, you're still growing. There is no sign of anything slowing down. Why would you do that? I asked the team to do it because we didn't see the prices are going up, and we might have gone a little bit further up, and we brought it down. So that kind of mild it. I'm a little bit optimistic on that dimension. Look, the world is an unpredictable place. And what happens in Russia has an effect on the farmers in Idaho. And outside of that, I don't see anything that is going to be dramatically negative in the U.S. market. And from Chobani's perspective, I don't see it.
I love that idea of cutting prices. It feels very anti to what a lot of corporate cultures might do, and just say, let's ride this for a little bit. You have written or thought about kind of the anti-CEO playbook. What is it that, and I want to kind of to roll into your thoughts about creating a sustainable business that impacts so many and so much. What is it that you don't like about a lot of leaders that are out there?
I should be the last person in the field of business. Like growing up.
But you are.
I am. So I did not have any visibility on a field of business. Like I did not study business. I never worked anywhere. I never knew anyone who started business. I had not been to any corporate places, even now, very limited. So when I started Chobani in upstate New York, so I am clueless how to start or grow a business.
But there's farming in your family.
There's farming. There's definitely there is this tradition. But when I grow up, I found myself very distant from business from the perspective of how a simple shepherd's son in a village sees the rich people and business community. What does that mean to me? And I don't see any differences. And as someone who lives in upstate New York, who lives in Idaho, or a little bit outside of the city. And there is this negative view. And negative view is known act of business all along, that someone gets rich on somebody else's back, something is get damaged because somebody needs to be successful, and then there's this created class of people who are maybe separate than the rest of us, right? Yeah. There is this group of people, group of industries that is somehow chosen, that is me talking when I'm 20 years old. And I said, well, how do I get into this field not to become someone grow up hating?
Yeah.
And how do I exercise?
Your 40-year-old hating,
when I was
20-year-old hating your 40-year-old version of you.
That's the dimension.
Yeah.
I'm in this old factory, 4 factory workers. I'm surrounded with community and the farmers. And I started this, and this is growing, and I'm doubting myself every step of the way. But what I said is, I don't want to be that guy. The second thing is I don't want to be the company who closed this factory and abandoned the community. And the things that I have seen that they have done there for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. What I found out is if you operate in your true self, how you are in your home, in your community, as a community member or a father or a mother or whoever, business is not distant from anything else like that. You want to do the right thing. You want to do things that you love. You want to do it with the others that participate. And if you apply those simple human conditions into a business in a very dominant way, it becomes a very powerful machine.
Well, you are a believer in sharing the success with your employees, and you did that several years ago, giving your employees ownership within the company, which is just one of the facets of what you do. What does a sustainable business mean to you? And I hear what you're saying, and I love it. And I bet, don't you all love it? Like, it sounds like the way we should run so much. But you're not public yet.
You're right.
But often the conversation is, how do you balance doing that? Being a good company, thinking about the community at large, your workers, and then those beyond, making sure people all can have access to nutritious, healthy food, with being a profitable company, to make sure you can maintain that business going forward and keep it going.
This is the key question, and you nailed it.
Is it easy or hard?
It's hard and it's easy. It's easy if you believe, and completely believe, not just on the surface, but you're completely convinced that being conscious of your employees, being conscious of your community, being conscious of the communities that you're serving as your products, or being aware of the environment and humanity all, is really good for business.
Yeah.
If you're convinced that if you operate in that center, then it's extremely easy. Because everything that you do for humanity is good for your company. Everything that you do for environment is good for your company. Everything you do for your employees is good for your company. Everything you do, it just gives you another dimension that you will be faster, you will be more profitable.
But does everything you do go, forgive me, black and white, go right to the bottom line?
It doesn't in that moment.
Okay.
But if you have a long-term view,
right?
You asked me in the early days, you say, how is business? I never had a best year. I say it very little sound. Because what happens is all those things, accumulations of all those things that you do, come to a surface in a really bad day. If you look at Chobani's performance during the pandemic, during the inflation, post-pandemic, we broke all the records, and we shouldn't be. You can compare Chobani with all the other big CPG companies, 3 times, 4 times, often even more times more performance metrics higher than any other ordinary company. And we are a sizable company. We're getting close to be $2.5 billion sales, and we have dominant category in yogurt, and we're entering the categories like creamers and oat milk. So our resources are completely limited, way limited than compared to other CPGs.
Right.
But our fulfillment rates were almost 98, 97%. It's unheard of during the supply chain problems. Most of our peers were 60s and 70s.
So if you had a different culture and you didn't care so much about your workers, about making sure your food is healthier, reaching more.
Right.
You think about kids a lot, making sure kids have access. Do you think you'd be in the same financial situation today?
No.
Because
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be able to operate in there, so I needed to go train.
you couldn't do it.
Like, actually, business training, in my opinion, and I might be talking a little bit, business training is taking us, our natural being, into something that we are not. A traditional business training. Like if the business, today, if you go to some business schools like Harvard and some others, and I've been, I see some encouraging things are happening in there. It's coming back to our nature.
Yeah.
Stay human when you are in business, but truly, you don't really have to pretend to be something else or some other styles. I don't think Chobani would have been any successful if it wasn't in that dimension. If you change Chobani to be that company in an environment of public world, we will be failing in every dimension.
So do you get worried about, the stories that have been, plans to go public.
Right.
We've covered it. Is that still the plan? And do you,
Yes.
You can make a headline right now. It's just.
See, reporter is always reporter. Right?
No, but because
No,
it's
I
a
always
new dynamic that gets introduced potentially.
The best part of Chobani is we probably built a company that people often don't think about this. We still control 80% of our company, and 20% is a long-term pension fund of nurses and healthcare workers.
Right.
So 100% of this company is free from financial institutions. And we built over $2 billion infrastructures in the company. We've been around for 15 years, and we started with SBA loan.
Right.
And none of us have done this before. And we covered 23% of yogurt market, and we grew over 20% this year, and that's another 20% year before, and we're going to be another one next year. We are innovating like there is nobody else is innovating. But what I'm saying basically in this thing is whether I am public or not, I don't have to do it.
Yeah.
But this dream can be a public company if I choose to do it, or if people in the company ask me to do it, which is on the table. No, I haven't decided yet, but.
Has it moved off the table? Close? No, I'm just kidding.
It just doesn't matter, really. It just applies the same thing.
Is that because consumers care more about that, employers care more about that in terms of what the company stands for?
Yes, ma'am. So we are in a cross point right now in the business community, and I say it as loud as possible. It doesn't matter if you truly believe that this is good for business. You're going to have to be forced to do those things. And you brought into an amazing point here, is your daughters, the young people, energetic, passionate people who have very strong opinion what the world should be like.
Right.
And what should we care when it comes to gender, income inequality, environment, all those things that you're covering here today. Those opinions are very strong. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to change no matter what. And then you have this talented workforce are coming into the companies, are picking the companies and brands to work, is aligned with their mindset. And then you have this consumer is going that direction, is that looking at the cup, looking at the bottle, looking at the products and saying, what company is this? What kind of mindset do they have? What do they truly do? And we're living in this really connected world that you cannot pretend, you cannot lie, you cannot fool anybody. So you have to be truly this. So unless you put your act together now and start making changes in your company, A, good for business, B, tomorrow's consumer is not going to be there unless you make that changes. Tomorrow's talent is not going to be there unless you make changes. So your decision is today is, am I going to be relevant tomorrow, or am I going to be the garbage can?
We're going to get into a talk, because something very relevant to it is how you think about your workforce and who you bring into your workforce. Before I do that, because I feel like this fits with this, is we've all of a sudden this week had a bunch of stories, whether it's Walmart or the maker of Pringles, and they're talking about the impact of those diet drugs, Wegovy, Ozempic, on food purchasing. Walmart is researching data, watching data, and they're noticing different buying patterns. Mm-hmm. The CEO of Pringles and Cheez-Its, I love Cheez-Its, not Pringles so much. The company is studying it. Do you guys think about things like that? Because you've made no sugar products.
Yeah.
Does that at all come into it? Again, that's a community, like thinking about health of the community.
Food making in this country is whole another dimension.
Did you want to say horrendous?
No, whole another dimension.
Oh.
Right. I mean,
Sorry.
Where do you start? Where do you start? And you have, startups and companies like, passionate founders and entrepreneurs and saying like, I have to make a better soup, I have to make a better yogurt, I have to make a better bar, I have to make this and that. And then scaling those businesses are extremely hard, extremely difficult.
Right.
And what you see is none of them, most of them, they don't grow to challenge the category and make a change, a dramatic change. And Chobani we're lucky that we passed those dimensions. So the way that food is being made is exactly the same thing, with hand of 10, 12 large CPG companies, and the way that the food is made is exactly the same thing. Right? I entered the creamers category, and
it's competitive.
It's competitive, but you look at two major brands. See, this is the freedom I have. I can talk about anything. You have two major brands.
Being private? Oh, sorry.
Being independent. You have 70% of the creamers business. It's billions, maybe 3, 4, 5 billions. 70% of the creamers that's sold in this country is two major brands, and there's not even a drop of cream in there. 80% of the people think that purchasing those creamers think, we made all the studies, that they are made from creams. And I can go from category to category to give you an examples how much these big CPG food makers are confusing purposely or misleading purposely, or not implementing the good food making practices that people, ordinary people, outside of New York City can have an access to those foods. Food can be made extremely better than what it is today out there.
How many of you are going to go home and look at the containers?
Yeah, take a look at it.
You're all going to do it.
Take a look at it. It looks like a painting. Like one of those brands, I don't want to say the name, you can actually put the powder on the air and flame it. It can burn.
You're really going to go home.
It's in YouTube. It's shameful what's going on out there. But again,
and that's with oversight.
They have the reach. right? I mean, they have the way to supply to Walmart, give the pricing, give the promotions, put it in the ads, and all these commercial things that they can do. And the person, if I'm a teacher, if I'm a factory worker, and I'm going to a shop and I have a budget, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. No, it's very hard for people.
It's very hard for people. And when you're looking at all these health challenges, you have diabetes and children, for God's sake, in this country. Where is the responsibility of that CEO, of that food maker who says, I can make this better? But no, I'm making 25%, 30%, 50% margins, so make the challenge. And I give one challenge. Every CEO should be feeding exactly the same food to their own families every single day. Every single day. Before they give it to somebody else's children. Give that creamer to your wife, give that yogurt to your children, and then let's see who gets on fire, for God's sake.
This reminds me so much of like the tech revolution over the last decade.
You get me going, I'm sorry.
No, don't stop. But we only have 6 minutes left. But the tech revolution, where you'd have tech CEOs or tech founders, and they'd be like, yeah, my kids don't watch TV, they don't have a cell phone. Like, it's a similarity.
Yeah. But we can solve all these problems. We can solve it because you have people, passionate people, coming out of schools and going into these companies. I cannot say by shaming big companies we can solve the problem, but by influencing them, by going in and convince them, by seeing the data from the consumers and where the trend is going, like what you mentioned, and these things can be fixed. Yeah. And if the large company can change, if the business community can change to come to a point that you've just made new problems in this world. I'm on the board of the Sustainable Development Goals. We are halfway through that with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we are nowhere. But I am optimistic because I see the signs. Like you're going to see, Gideon is going to come here to talk about refugees. What we've done with the corporate world, taking the examples from Chobani hiring refugees, and see how much impact that has in the refugees' world and the refugees' life, and how much impact that has in the company. And we took that idea and expanded into all the corporations. We have over 300 companies worldwide hiring hundreds of thousands of refugees. And that's just what convincing the CEOs and companies. If the CEOs and companies are convinced from the whole, holistically, from the workers, management, and the shareholders, right. And, all those financial shareholders, that this is the good way to operate, we solve all the problems in the world in a heartbeat.
If you weren't from Turkey and came to this country, would we be having this conversation about refugees? I'm just wondering. Because it's very personal, right? Like
yeah. I mean, my journey is, this country has been amazing for me. And I was just talking to New York City, people who are having migrants coming in. My tent is right there with the kiosk that giving them the work authorization. We're getting their information to connect to the companies that we have. And I never thought that the boy from eastern part of Turkey would go make a home in upstate New York and go into a old factory with 4 factory workers, and then 10 years later sitting with you and trying to tell the world how to run their business. I never thought this would happen. But that's the magic of this country, and this is what we can do in this country.
By hiring, because you've hired a ton of refugees.
Yes, ma'am. The best thing I've ever done in my life.
What are leaders?
It really is. These are the things that what the business is extremely powerful on. You can make dramatic changes on life and community, and you see it right there. And it's sustainable. You don't have to go back for money. You can actually do it right in front of you. And if you can make hundreds of thousands of people in your company power to make those changes in their individual, effort, it becomes like you go to home and you put your head in your bed. It's like, is this a job? Is this a work? This is the most beautiful thing you can do. And then you can go to, your shareholders and says, look at the results.
Oh, so that doesn't mean you are going public?
No. I mean, I'm talking about other businesses.
Just kidding. No, but what are leaders missing by not including refugees? Like, we talk so much about the importance of diversity in all its forms, but the importance of refugees as part of your work.
On that one, Carol, I have to tell you, I started this in 2016. I begged for 4 companies to put their name out there that they will be hiring refugees. Today I have over 300 companies. McDonald's just joined. Subway just joined, Nokia just joined, I mean, Pfizer, everybody else. We put our attention, I spend 1/3 of my time, sometimes half of my time on this.
Can I just say Amazon, H&M,
Amazon,
Adidas, Hilton,
Amazon,
L'Oreal, Pfizer.
I mean, Gideon is going to talk about
It's a who's who. I know Gideon's.
He's the CEO, he's the master. But we pay one attention to this topic, like hire refugees. We did economic studies, scientific studies, consumer studies, brand studies in each market. We call it market. And then one by one, we convinced these companies. And once they saw the result and they just got deeper and deeper and deeper, I have to say, if you pay attention and you go and convince from the perspective of business, we can solve this problem. We can make a dent in this problem. And today, I think hiring refugees from the company's perspective, that shift is already done. People are hiring it. People are talking about hiring it. People, I mean, all these companies that you can name up. So what else can we do? You know, we can do all of those things because we are convinced that this is good for refugees, this is for community, this is what we are all about in this country, and it's magical what it does to companies. It's magical what it does to companies.
So what do you hope in our last minute that this group here, who's heard some great conversations when we think about sustainable businesses and all its configurations, what do you hope that they go home and think about or actually do? I'm 50 now, my 20-year-old, my 18-year-old, very skeptical of business community and coming from the perspective of pushing out. And what I can tell from my perspective is we have so much to go, still a long way to go, but I see the signs. I'm very, very hopeful, and I'm not usually this optimistic on these things. I'm very hopeful that we're going to make this change on the world of on shortcoming, that the business community is going to lead it. It's going to have to lead it. We cannot, there's no other ways. Because governments are working so well?
Oh, forget about the politics side of things. And I think the gathering like this is so helpful that we can learn from each other, interact with each other, and inspire each other, and create a community for common goals, because we have no other choices. We are running out of time on all dimensions, and if you know anything about human spirit, is when we commit to something, we can make this happen. And if it's going to happen, it's going to start here in this country. And if it's going to start in this country, it's going to start in New York. That's what I think.
I totally agree. Hamdi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Lanaya Irvin, CEO of Coqual, and Aniela Unguresan, founder of Edge Certified Foundation, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Elizabeth Fournier.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining me here today. We have a big topic to cover and not a huge amount of time to do it, so I want to dive right in. I know we are taking questions from the audience that we'll address towards the end of here. I think by now you know how to do that, so please go ahead and submit anything you want us to talk about at the end of the session. But first, I want to start this discussion by pulling up a story that Bloomberg published last week, which ran with the headline, "Corporate America promised to hire a lot more people of color. It actually did." That headline and that story can only tell part of the picture. And we followed up and we looked at it a few days later with the second story. Hiring more people of color doesn't mean retention. So my first question to you guys, hiring is just the beginning of the journey for companies that want to build a more diverse workforce. The next step is making sure those hires feel safe, supported, and they want to stick around. We know through huge amounts of research, and I think we have a chart that shows this, the US workforce is still overwhelmingly white. So what are some steps that companies can take to make sure they have the right infrastructure in place so to actually retain the talent that they're able to bring through the door? Lanaya, I want to start with you.
Sure. I think we saw this this data come out, and it's definitely something that is positive, very exciting. That said, hiring to address representation woes has been a shortcut for companies. I think that they're realizing that without any evaluation of internal structural barriers, that it's not creating the outcomes that they would hope for, right? And so, I think the companies that we spend a lot of time with, we spend a lot of time encouraging them to realize that, look, you have to be aware of the lived experiences of talent once they come through the door, right? How are they being developed? How are they advancing? And so over the past, a couple of years, many companies are actually beginning to do not only the behavioral work when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but structural work, committing to looking at some of the systemic and process, perhaps, barriers to outcomes and retention. And we call it looking at the talent cycle end to end. So of course that includes talent acquisition, hiring, and where bias might creep into those decisions, but also performance management systems, right? How is there bias in ratings or performance evaluations, the way feedback is given? When it comes to advancement, promotion committees, promotion panels, how are those structured, right? What are the kind of processes for determining who has access to recognition and or development programs? And then, of course, pay equity work, compensation, looking at where there's structural or process that leads to perhaps bias or humanness in the way pay decisions are made. And so by committing to this structural kind of audit, it's one way to ensure that the pursuit is for equity for everyone. It actually benefits everyone in the talent system. And in our research, we see that there's need for that because we've studied equity at Coqual, and we've done a series of studies, and it's clear that there's some talent receiving signals on a regular basis that their contributions are worth less, right? Women, of course, are overwhelmingly aware of the pay gap. Black and Latino men, for example, are more than twice as likely to feel in performance evaluations that they're just being judged by a different set of criteria altogether. Asian talent, more often than not, feel, okay, well, what's in their performance evaluations doesn't reflect their output, right? They're not getting credit for the work they do. The work that they contribute is being overlooked. Black women, for example, 4 times as likely to report being passed over for promotion by equally or less qualified peers. And the data shows that 42% of Black women in this past year were looking to leave their roles. And so, there's a real disconnect because companies put so much resource towards hiring talent, but not enough effort into how you retain them.
And Aniela, I know a lot of your work is around helping companies figure out those best practices and then adhere to them. How does this sort of play into how you think about that and the advice and the way that you interact with companies?
I think that the key thing is to say that the ultimate goal is more balanced representation. And hiring is one of the ways in which we can ensure a more balanced representation. Now, if you ask companies, when you look at the major career flows, so hiring, promotion, and retention, their first focus will be hiring because companies feel that they control better to whom they offer a job. And of course, for historically underrepresented populations, you have to rely on hiring as well. But then what is really interesting is that if you keep in mind that the ultimate goal is not hiring is means to an end, but the ultimate goal is really representation. And then you do a very straightforward analytical work in saying, well, this representation is a result of hirings plus exits minus, and promotions minus at one level, plus at the next level. What we see, especially with organizations in the US, is that while their hiring flows have been stronger, their exit flows for that diverse talent was stronger than the exit flows for the historically overrepresented talent. So revolving door, in, out. And the reason, it's exactly this systematic approach that we need to take to ensure that there is pay equity, there are policies and practices to ensure equitable career flows, and then there is an inclusiveness of the culture. And I think that one thing that we need to to stop ourselves from doing is that very often when diverse talent leaves the organization, there is a part of the organization who turns around and said, we've told you. That is not the kind of talent that fits with our culture, that fits with our organization. Well, let's pause on that for 1 second and ask ourselves what kind of infrastructure we have in place that might be conducive for different talent not to feel equally valued and respected, which leads to them leaving the organization.
And at the same time, employees are only sort of one part of the ecosystem that companies, particularly very big publicly listed companies, have to deal with. And we are seeing at the moment a sort of backlash against the ESG world from, often very right-wing policymakers and politicians, but also from investors who are supporting ESG-focused shareholder proposals at a lower rate. And then at the same time, you have this sort of huge labor movement, this swell of labor and union activity in the US at the moment. How do companies manage the key stakeholders, the shareholders, the employees, and the customers?
Well, maybe I can start with that. I think that one of the things that is really important is that it does come down to values. And it does come down to shared values. I mean, you need to operate on a certain number of shared principles with your employees, with your shareholders, with all your stakeholders. And I think that one of the things that is so impressive, I would say, is seen from outside. I'm based out of Switzerland. When we look into this movement in the United States, I mean, there was a story that was run by your colleagues in Bloomberg saying that 75% of Gen Z take D&I in the workplace not as an aspiration, but as a requirement. Mm-hmm. And then there is the political backlash and the cultural wars against the D&I. So it is almost like the leaders of today are not responsible enough to create the kind of workplace that the leaders of tomorrow want to work in. And then it comes down again to making some choices. Which are the companies that we choose to work with? Which are the companies that we decide to invest in? Which are the companies that we want to buy products and services from? And it comes with this alignment on the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a driver of sustainable business performance. It's not a layer on top of the organizational core purpose, but it's fundamental to it.
And I want to dig a bit more into that, the generational divide there, because as you said, this is an extremely important issue for Gen Z workers joining the workforce. Mm-hmm. They rate companies' DEI priorities, as you said, sort of 75% of them, that's top of their list. That's not the same for the people leading the company. The research shows it's, I think, sort of below 50% for the baby boomer generation. And so you've got this gap between the people ultimately doing the hiring and the people that they really want to hire. And how can that gap be closed? And the sort of the urgency around that feels like very of the moment.
No, this is about shared values. It's interesting because, the generational disconnect, we all experience it in a day-to-day. We see it in our data. We see it amongst our colleagues, family members. Gen Z, even millennials, are looking through a completely different lens, right? They have a completely different view of the world than baby boomers would, because the world is different, fundamentally different. And so, yes, they lean into values and purpose and meaning and career progression over salary. And yes, they care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, because guess what? More than 50% of 16-year-olds, those under 16 in this country, are of color, right? I mean, again, emerging talent, if you want to look towards the future and prepare your organizations for that future, will, look different than they did 20, 30 years ago. And so, we see it, in our data, young talent is coming into the workplace. They have a different set of expectations altogether, right? When we think about the various stakeholders, employees, talent being one of them, right? As far as an intangible asset in your organization, really important. They have a different set of expectations. And they're also experiencing the workplace in maybe they're not experiencing it differently, but they're expressing the way they experience it differently. higher rates of stress, higher rates of burnout, right? We see it in our data. You know, recent study we launched, 1 in 4 millennials, for example, are looking to leave the organization, like most and all of the time, right? Can you imagine that? Not just some of the time, not just I've considered it once this year, most or all of the time, right? And you know, compare that, that's twice the rate of baby boomers. But also when you think about the way they perceive bias and barriers and being treated differently, they are acutely aware of difference, they're acutely aware of the ways that they are treated, tokenism, things of that nature. We just launched a study around gender. And, you know, we looked at the data, you know, Gen Z, millennials in professional settings, far more likely to report having experienced gender-based prejudice in the workplace. 60% of Gen Z and millennials report having experienced it in the work environment. That's compared to 24% of baby boomers who've been working for a very long time. Now, it doesn't mean that they're experiencing it at higher rates, right, than other generations, but they're aware of gender. They can communicate their experiences. They've lived through Me Too. They've lived through George Floyd. They've lived through XYZ, and they say, you know what? I recognize this. I don't have to accept it. I can report it or at least be aware of it and its impact on my career. So I think fundamentally, I think if organizations want to be competitive, it's an actual necessity to be able to activate this talent cohort. But one thing, I mean, just back to your earlier kind of point around, you know, kind of backlash and ESG and where we are now, you know, I do think, you know, some of this backlash is really just a result of progress. I do think it is pushback on a lot of the work that has been done and achieved in the recent years. And I don't think diversity, equity, inclusion, I don't think social issues and being a stakeholder in the communities that we touch as corporate actors, that's not going away. It's top of mind for investors. It's top of mind for board directors. And I think that, you know, there's going to be resistance, but I think it really, really, if you look at demographics, if you look at climate, if you look at a rapidly transforming world, change, it causes friction and it's hard. And I think the resistance is just due to inevitable change.
And all of these things we've talked about beyond the sort of basic hiring and retention numbers, the metrics are difficult to track. Often we're talking about, you know, things that we get by asking people questions about what they've encountered in the workplace. But it's often people, when they want to judge how a company's doing, they want to look at cold, hard data. It's also what we do here at Bloomberg. So what are some of the ways that companies can establish the metrics that they want to track, make sure that they're following them, and then communicate them to all those stakeholders in a way that makes sense and sort of tells people what they need to know? Aniela, do you want to?
Yes, Lizzie, just one thing that I think is very important. We have the feeling and the conception that it's harder to track everything that is behind the S. Everything can be tracked. Yeah. It is a science. You know, I'm an economist by training, and when I started to work in this space more than a decade ago, it was amazing to me to which extent we feel it's an art, and everybody has their own opinions. But it does come down to some hardcore metrics. It's not more difficult to measure what is going on in terms of employee satisfaction, employee retention, than it is to understand where the consumer want your company to go and what kind of products and services want. It just requires the same discipline and the same rigor. And I think that one of the things that probably, if you look at it, there are different types of metrics. They are the metrics that are the top of the iceberg. So this kind of very synthetic metrics that in one look will tell you a little bit what is going on in the company. And then there are a certain number of metrics that will give you the explanation of why what you have seen in those synthetic metrics, why that is the case and what is going on. And I think that by excellence, the metric that shows a little bit what's going on in the company, it's the gross pay gap, because that reflects all the representation balances or imbalances in the pipeline, as well as the portion of the pay gap which cannot be explained by objective factors. Because that shows a little bit how effective the internal processes are to ensure equity and really rewarding equal pay for equivalent work. And then some of those indicators that are underneath, it's what we have discussed, measuring the career flows that contribute to the representation, asking employees how they feel about their workplace experience, and then measuring the differences between the different cohorts in your workplace to see if people, based on their characteristics, experience workplace differently. You know, if I want to be very extreme, if everybody's equally unhappy about something, that's also important to know, because that means that it's related not to the characteristics of the individual, but to the workplace itself. So I think that these are some of those metrics, the very synthetic one, the pay, and then those that are underneath the career flows, and then the employee's experience, and then the employee satisfaction.
Lanaya, anything?
No, yeah, I think, of course, gathering employee sentiment is really important, right? When you're trying to understand, kind of tone around belonging, inclusion, absolutely. But when we think about internally, those metrics, I love that, the idea of the synthetic. There are, of course, going to be kind of core metrics that they're going to capture. Of course, compensation being one of them. They'll look at promotion advancement rates. So we really promote at Coqual disaggregation. And, measurement in our data collection is almost more important, I believe, for a company. Collect as much data as you can, qualitative, quantitative, spend time with your teams. It's almost more important than having clarity around what the transparency bits are going to be internally and externally, what the disclosure bits are going to be. Just gather as much information as possible, right? So whether it's pay or you're looking at advancement, kind of years in role, right? You'd be surprised, and that's what we promote to disaggregation. With every single kind of core metric, disaggregate that. You'd be surprised at how many companies will say, oh, they're looking at advancement, they're looking at promotion rates or years in role and seat, but they're not disaggregating at the intersection of gender or race or line of business or country. Like, there are instances where it's like disaggregation helps you tell a story. And it also helps you determine where the greatest areas of opportunity are, right? Because when you have an enterprise-wide intervention, it's really not as effective. If you realize, like, oh, well, within this particular line of business, in these functions at VP level, we see this, right? And so to the extent that you can disaggregate, it makes it so that you can actually use the data. And that's internally, right? And externally, you can determine, okay, well, what of this is information I want to be able to communicate and set goals around for our teams, right? May not have the answers, but I can say employee base, we've collected data. We realize there's some work to do, and we're going to set out to do it. You don't have to have all the answers. Then you may have other sets of data. The more you collect, the more you can determine what you're going to use and disclose for disclosure or whatever the case may be. It's okay, this is board relevant. Let's take this to the board. Now, obviously, in the past couple of years, we've seen companies from a public disclosure standpoint, companies have to determine what makes sense for them. We've seen more companies, willing to publicly disclose their EEO1 data. It's still a low number, voluntarily doing that. But that is something. And I will say, collecting more data, there's nothing wrong with collecting data. It's what you do with it on the back end that really matters. And on the internal front, obviously, as it relates to moving the needle, that's what matters for your teams. Obviously, that's what matters when you're looking to manage risk and, kind of find either any disruptive behavior and or processes that present risk to the organization. But publicly, I think many of us probably believe that the SEC is going to, over time require more relevant, workforce data to be disclosed. And that's per the recommendation of the Investment Advisory Council that the SEC has. More, not less. So there's no downside in having and being armed with as much data around your workforce, and then just determining how you're going to use it.
And when we talk about disclosure and transparency, we've been talking predominantly about the US, where these EEO1 forms are collected and where the SEC is intervening in things like this. But both of you work globally. Aniela, I know you're based in Europe, and a lot of Coqual's research is done across the globe. There is a difference in how countries and governments and regulators approach these kind of things, like right down to the level of self-ID and what information companies are allowed to gather from people and then disclose about them. How do you see that across different jurisdictions, and how does a multinational company who might have employees and offices across the world think about how to navigate the different regions in which they're operating?
I think that the complexity really lies in those jurisdictions where there are gray areas. You know, the jurisdiction where things are clear, like in France, you cannot collect data on ethnic origin. That is clear. Belgium, the same. But in those jurisdictions where there is a gray area, like for example in China, can we ask about gender? Can we ask about, it leaves a lot of room for this legal limbo and for the interpretation almost on a case-by-case basis. So these are the more complicated issues to solve for organizations. Now, I think that one of the great contributions of large organizations is that they do tend to have consistent ways of looking at these aspects across all their geographical areas and just being creative in how they do it in certain jurisdictions by staying on the right side of the law. So for example, I come back to the French example. In France, we have worked with US-based companies that wanted to ask a question on ethnic origins, and then the question was simply, are you part of an ethnic origin in your country? Yes or no, right? And then you go on an anonymized basis, and then you aggregate the data. It will still allow you to see some trends. It will not go to that level of granularity that we discussed, which is so desirable, but at least it gives a signal, again, that for the organization as a whole, there is a way in which these issues need to be treated consistently. And in some countries, the organizations did push the legislation to move in the direction of more transparency, more disclosure, UK being one example, who started by saying, absolutely, we do not track pay based on race and ethnicity because that gives the possibility of more discrimination, more sophisticated discrimination. It took 2 years till the regulator in the UK came back and said, no, absolutely, we have to go granular and we have to check how the data looks like when we disaggregate it by race and ethnicity, because it's only then when you can take meaningful decisions and you can remediate in meaningful ways.
And when you're doing research, how does it affect how you approach different regions and how you think about positioning questions and positioning the kind of data that you want to get out of a population?
Right. Well, obviously it's one thing when you're, executing and constructing your self-ID strategy globally, right, as an enterprise, as a company. As a research firm, oftentimes we're operating mixed methods. So there's certain data we can collect quantitatively, and then there are things that we do have to, kind of insights we have to extract via qualitative. And some of that is anonymized focus groups and, really trying to kind of target if we're looking at, kind of underrepresented groups in a certain organization or majority groups, or obviously looking at things that are kind of broader in concept, generation, mental health, things of that nature. We are typically doing mixed methods, and so that makes it a little bit easier for us to be pretty direct, right? And of course, in our interviews, things that aren't focus groups, that aren't, kind of large numbers of employees, one-on-ones, we don't necessarily have to, kind of name that particular respondent. In some cases we'll use, name and title or executive, whatever the case, because it's a quote or something that is shared to galvanize other companies in the region. But for the most part, we're able to, anonymize a lot of what we need to still be able to tell the story. And the organizations who've been partners of ours and supporting and underwriting our research for the past 20 years, appreciate the rigor with which we take, acknowledging that, they have limitations where they can't they can't capture some of what we are able to. Yeah, at least not in self-ID, right? So.
I feel like there's still so much more for us to unpack here. We could probably stay on this stage for the rest of the day, but I am aware I want to give the audience the chance to get their questions in. I know we have Meg here with the iPad, so over to you.
First one is, while it is true, obviously, that Gen Z requires DEI and is more understanding about it, how do we get them to vote so that their voice can be heard in politics, which is not currently happening at the moment?
Yeah.
You know, there is one beautiful experiment that succeeded in some countries. Lower the voting age. Get them to start when they are 16. And show them that there is a path for them. They can build political careers so that by the age of 30 they can become prime ministers. This is the case in Austria, for example, that lowered the voting age one generation ago. And now they see politicians are young, corporate leaders are more or less within one generation, not 5 from them. So I think that that's one very successful way.
I think that's a great idea, right? You know, the idea of encouraging civic participation earlier, right? And you know, perhaps even lowering the kind of the age on, you know, kind of running for office in certain regions, lowering the age. You know, so it might be harder for them to get out and vote for someone of a certain age who they feel has absolutely no kind of connectivity to their life and you know, their generation. But I love the idea of having them participate sooner. I do think there's an opportunity as well. We have to find ways to, you know, we definitely have to find ways to get younger people in office. I mean, if you want young people to vote, I think it'd be great for them to have options of multiple generations, I think.
Now that I think of it, while lowering the age for the young generation, I think that capping the age till which the politicians can stay in politics would be a good compliment.
I'm glad you said it.
Are you going to put a number on it, or are we just going to...
Under 70, let's say under 70. For
the
sure.
gap in generation cannot be bigger than 3 generations.
Right.
That's it.
Thank you.
A follow-up question that we did get on that was, how do you get more Gen Z in office, and how do you get more young people in office? So I know we just talked about it a little bit, but any ideas for how to get people more involved in politics?
Absolutely. You know, I do think that we should have limits on terms so that you create space for others to come and lead. I think that that's really, really important. The idea that someone could hold a seat until their very last breath. We see it happening. This is not the Supreme Court, but we see it happening among politicians. I think that that's a failure to the citizens of this country. If you have, 40 years to maybe president, but then, you know, the candidates are 30 years older than that, and I think there's a real opportunity to signal that new voices, fresh voices, and I also think we might be able to attract a younger generation of politicians and voters if we required anyone who ran for office to have service in any other industry. Teacher, school administrator, a doctor, someone who's worked in financial services, someone who's been an engineer in tech. Those are the people that I want making decisions about my life, right? Individuals who can sit alongside one another and say, no, actually, I know how that works. Yes, you could say that it's a casino, but there are lawyers on both sides of that financial transaction. Let me talk you through that, right? And/or, absolutely, let's talk about cryptography, or let's talk about the potential harms of artificial intelligence. And guess what? There are 15 people in this room who studied that at some point and/or worked in the field. And so I think that if we bring people who are practitioners into politics, we're undoubtedly going to see younger participants in that particular service.
And maybe one last word is, I think that we have to give meaning again to public service. Yeah. And we need some role models, politicians that embody the values that societies seem to be behind. Fairness, equity, transparency, investing for the next generations.
Absolutely.
I think that the combination of role models that young people can aspire to with revaluing public service, it's very important.
Agreed.
Thank you. I'm aware we have run down our time. Thank you very much for the questions. And thank you so much to our guests for an insightful and lively conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Nicole Hildebrandt, Managing Director and Partner at Boston Consulting Group, Anil Vasagiri, Senior Vice President and Head of Property Solutions at Swiss Re, and Ahmed Wani, Co-founder and CEO of One Concern, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Darini Bala Gadiaram.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day at the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. We're here to talk about physical climate risk, a ticking economic time bomb. We were definitely trying to get your attention with that title. I'm joined here by Nicole, Anil, and Ahmad. We'll go ahead and jump straight into it. So physical climate risk, especially in 2023. We've heard every superlative in the language being used to describe the frequency and intensity of different events that have been happening across the world, like especially when it comes to flooding, right? I think there was like a 10-day window in September where we saw 12 different countries and territories being hit by flooding. There was like Libya and Hong Kong and Greece and Brazil and New York. So I'll start with you, Nicole, from your view of climate and sustainability in financial institutions. How do you see the extent of these climate perils being factored into climate disclosures today, like TCFD, for instance?
Yeah. Look, so I think the headline answer on this is that there's still quite a disconnect between the reality on the ground in terms of the physical risks businesses and individuals and other real assets are facing and what you're seeing show up in TCFD-aligned disclosures. Just to give you some data to support that statement, we've been doing a lot of research on this over the recent months, looked at a really large set, about 5,000 CDP disclosures from 2022. If you look at and scan across that set, across corporates and FIs, you see roughly 80% of companies recognize that physical climate risk is a material issue, right? The disconnect is actually in the measurement of the impact and then the kind of the level of the quantification. So of that 80%, you see only about 50% who are actually attempting to quantify that impact. And then of that subset, it's like 2/3 who are quantifying an impact that is quite small relative to the size of the business, something like less than 5% of revenues. If you contrast that with then what we're kind of hearing on the ground with all of our clients across industries and sectors, you feel that companies do recognize that these risks are real, right? So there's a sense of, look, I know this is a thing I need to be thinking about. It's affecting my business. I'm seeing it affecting other people's businesses. But I'm not sure I'm quantifying all of that yet, right? So I think that's the inherent nature of the disconnect we're seeing.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder to everyone, in case you have any questions for our panelists as well, we'll be taking that at the end of the panel, so please feel free to use the QR code. But just bouncing off of what you just mentioned, Nicole and Anil, since you're representing one of the world's largest reinsurers, Swiss Re here, how do you see this gap between reported losses, economic losses, versus insured losses?
Yeah, no, thanks, Darini. I mean, I think that's an interesting dynamic, right, between what is incurred versus what is insured or what is paid. And to understand the sort of interplay between these two, I think we should look at some detail. And if we start with what is insured economic losses, right? So what you see here is a illustration of the insured economic losses worldwide over the last 50 years. And you see that the trend line is slowly creeping up. And some of that is understandable. If you go back to the early parts of the timeline, you see that increase, and that can be explained by advance in the economic activity. So as in any given geography, as the economic activity picks up, the built environment, the value of the built environment goes up, and then whenever an event happens, you see the corresponding impact on the losses, and that trend line is sort of what you see there. Mm-hmm. But if you sort of double click on the losses, going back to the earlier slide, if you double click on the losses over the last 10 years, there's an interesting dynamic, right? So the latter 5-year period, the average economic loss in any given year over the last 5 years is almost twice the loss of is twice the annual average in the earlier 5-year period. And this is something that you cannot explain away by the built environment value increase or anything like that. So this is a fundamental interplay between all the different factors, the climate change factors, and some of the perils, the volatility, the increased frequency and severity of the perils that are associated. Now, these losses include both the physical damage as well as the time element, right? But physical damage associated with a given event as well as the time element. But the bottom line is you see that the trend is going up, and given the increased volatility, I think that line is will continue to sort of trend in not the positive direction there. Now, when it comes to the economic losses or uninsured losses, the delta between what is economic versus what is insured is what we call the protection gap, right? And what you see here in the next slide is that illustration of that protection gap. Each bar there represents the quantum or the delta between what is actual incurred economic loss versus what is paid. So the higher the bar is, the greater is the protection gap. And you see that for 2 periods, right? So this is over the last 20 years. So what is unmistakable here is that even the delta, as fast as the insured losses are creeping up, the uninsured losses are going at a faster clip. If you look at US, Canada, you see that the protection gap is almost 2x of what it was in 2001 versus 2020. And over the world, that's gone up by more than 3x, right? So that's the sort of the dynamic you see play here. And here, both the property damage, the physical damage, as well as all the various components of business interruption, both tied to the event as well as the non-damage BI comes into play. And that's really the sort of the dynamic that you're seeing here.
Absolutely. And kind of drilling into the micro impact of this protection gap on housing, for instance, Nicole, how do you see that impact contributing to this overall protection gap?
Yeah. So, look, physical risk affects companies, it affects real assets, it affects, there's a multitude of stuff in that bar in US and Canada. A big piece of that is what's happening to US housing stock. So a couple of statistics for you about why we care about this. US housing stock is a over $40 trillion asset class as of end of last year. It's one of the most important sources of wealth accumulation for Americans in the US. This is true in other countries as well. And the actual and estimated future losses associated with physical perils is quite meaningful for US houses. We've done some research with one of our partners, CoreLogic, who has a climate risk analytics platform that's focused on the US mortgage market. Based on their data, if you think about kind of current day annual expected losses for the US housing market, it's on the order of $60 billion a year. That equates to about 2% of what consumers spend on housing. It's also roughly 40% of the total amount of billion-dollar losses that are associated with these big weather events that NOAA tracks. So it's pretty significant. It's rising. So 60 million today is going to go up to something like over 70 billion in 2050, and that's actually under the moderate climate risk scenarios that exist in the market, right? All of this is probabilistic, so that's kind of a medium case scenario. A worst case scenario will look much, much worse. And then finally, and this ties to what we were just looking at with Anil, a lot of the perils are not being fully insured. So flooding is one of the most significant risks associated with real assets like housing.
in the US, you are required when you're getting your mortgage to buy insurance if you're in what's called the 100-year floodplains or the special flood hazard areas. The reality is that these maps, which are maintained by FEMA, are quite outdated, and a lot of risk is happening outside of the areas where people are required to get insurance. Roughly, it's about a third of the estimated expected losses from physical climate events from flooding are actually happening outside of the special flood hazard areas. So that's really significant and something we all need to be thinking about, because the US housing ecosystem is quite large, right? There's a securitized market, there's a lot of investors. It's more than just banks and their customers. One other thing to layer on top of that, when you think about the dynamics in the US, and I think this likely plays out in other parts of the world, is the population growth dynamics that are happening. So it's actually the case that there are many high-risk climate areas, particularly in the southeast of the United States, that are also the places that are witnessing a lot of population growth. So not only are we seeing a rise in the probability of significant climate events happening in different parts of the country and the nature of where those playing out changing, we're also seeing that people are often moving into the places that have some of the highest levels of risk.
That's interesting. And so that's obviously, impact at every individual family level. The other aspect that you mentioned, Anil, was like business interruption contributing to this protection gap, right? Because obviously everybody's focused on just direct damage to assets rather than the value of like the interruption of the business itself. But when we talk about business interruption, it's not just about activities happening within a company. There are a lot of externalities we have to account for, like power feeding into that company, water, roadways leading into that company, et cetera. So Ahmad, how do you account for those externalities in a meaningful way?
Thank you, Dharini. And as we've heard, right, like the U.S. commercial facilities annually, or at today, are losing up to $100 billion in losses from business interruption. These are uninsured. This is obviously not an insignificant number. And if you look at the screen right now, this is just an example of a lot of those properties. These are 5 properties. None of them are in the flood zone. You can see the flood zone. It's in the blue, right? So they all get a green report card when they go for their TCFD disclosure, right? Because they're not in the flood zone. They're not going to be in the flood zone in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, right? So green report card. But when you actually consider the business impact to the business inside them, we are taking into account things like power outages, supply chain disruptions, transportation, whether their customers and employees are going to be able to show up or not. None of them are anywhere close to green. Literally, all of them are red. And this is the actual loss performance of these commercial properties in the last event. So you can see these properties had millions of dollars in cash flow impairment, uninsured. And there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of such properties today, every single year, having cash flow impact. Yet, every company which is doing a TCFD disclosure, every company without exception is getting a green report card, because they're just locating their buildings in the flood zone and they get the green report card. But they're not taking into account all these infrastructure which is actually contributing to the business inside these facilities. So really, and quite frankly, I'm not cherry picking these 5 properties. 90% of U.S. commercial properties are not in any high-risk flood zone. That number is in the 99% or higher if you consider just Fortune 1000 facilities. So they get a green report card because it's garbage in, garbage out. But 95% of them have a cash flow impairment even when their facilities are not affected at all. So really, what we are seeing is the risk is in the infrastructure, right? So we had, quite frankly, our work cut out for us. As I said, otherwise the data is really garbage in, garbage out. So obviously there is no download button where you can download all the world's power infrastructure data, every power line, every water pipe, or every transportation network. No utility has this data. And so what we started to do was, so what we do is we use AI to not generate words or essays like ChatGPT or generate images, but we generate infrastructure networks. And essentially starting off with smaller cities with real data from a handful of cities, we were able to then train models, use foundation models and machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to then validate our first ever model for basically entire nations, where we were able to basically synthesize the infrastructure grid, power, transportation, et cetera, for the United States. Now that we have something like that capability, what do you do with it? You hit it with any sort of disturbance. Something happening in the next 20 minutes or 3 days, like a hurricane, or something happening over the next 20 years. And you are able to now see those ripple effects propagate through that graph for the first time. And you are able to quantify cash flow impairment to any of these businesses due to their supply chains being impacted, due to their power outages. We had a month-long power outage in several areas last year due to hurricanes. This is just a glimpse of sort of the data which we are now seeing. So, you know, on the left, so these are, you know, 5,000 commercial mortgages, you know, in the Miami region, where we are considering flood and wind impact. This is over a 5-year period. So on the left side, if you consider just the direct flood impact to those properties, you know, and you are basically plotting here the probability of default. So on the left side is the rosy picture, right, where you're basically sort of like, hey, not really, like 95% of them actually are less than 5% probability of default, so not really a big problem. And the extreme left is actually without considering climate change, so backward looking, and then the second one, green one, is considering climate change. But now if you try to incorporate the impacts of infrastructure, in this case power and transportation, to those businesses, you start to actually uncover a lot of defaults because of business interruption, because of power outages, and really this is like, if this panel is called the ticking economic time bomb, this is the ticking economic time bomb, right? We are going to see a lot of these defaults because a lot of these securities are in some of these financial institutions.
So I guess switching to a slightly cheerier mood. And I'd like to, present this question to each of you, maybe starting with you, Anil. What is one development in recent years that makes you the most optimistic about our industry's ability to tackle climate financial risk?
Sure. So when it comes to, we're talking about impact to the physical risk and how you model, all the different loss scenarios, right? So, and in that context, when it comes to physical damage to a property, there's a fair degree of sophistication, and that part's well understood. And you see all the different tools and techniques applied that make it, fairly sophisticated in terms of our ability to understand. But when it comes to the notion of BI, it's still a lot of this analysis is done on heuristics and factors and things like that. So that sort of is the state of play. But what is exciting is the application of forward-looking models, especially when you're kind of thinking about climate change, where there is inherent volatility in both the frequency and severity of some of these perils. You cannot look back and base your models on historical claims, because those are always going to be underperforming the actual events. And so that's where some of the developments and the advances, things that Amar talked about, application of AI and usage of this AI in building forward-looking models to understand all the different scenarios. I think that's a pretty a fascinating and a positive development. And what's even more interesting is now you have different regulatory bodies also allowing usage of such techniques when it comes to quantifying the impact of all of these factors. So for me, that's the exciting development that I'm looking forward to.
What about you, Nicole?
I mean, yeah, second, analytics. I mean, maybe kind of looped into that is just some of the entrepreneurialism and innovation we're seeing in the kind of climate tech space, or whatever you want to call it. So, you know, what Ahmad's trying to build, what CoreLogic's trying to build. There's so many companies out there who are trying to really think about how do we bring data and analytics and AI to help us uncover a better view of the risks we're facing. I think the other one I would call out is just the role that the government is trying to play in these different spaces. So, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act we often think of as being really driving kind of the transition side of the story, but there are elements of that that are also kind of tied back into adaptation and resiliency financing, which is really important because some of these risks are going to stick around and we're not all going to move. So we need to figure out ways that we're also, once we understand the challenges, actually trying to mitigate them.
And you, Ahmad?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Nicole and Anil said, we wouldn't have been able to do this a few years back if we didn't have the ability to use sophisticated models, capture this data. You know, we started doing this for like small cities and small neighborhoods first, because it would take us, you know, like weeks to months to just go and beg the city government to collect this data. You know, the water department, the power department, the utilities didn't really have all data. Now with AI, you know, with foundation models, we are able to actually, you know, leverage those techniques to understand this impact at a much deeper level. And I feel like also at some level, you know, I do see some of the regulatory international bodies, multilateral organizations kind of speaking about this. I do hope that, you know, more institutions, especially regulatory bodies, kind of wake up to this because, you know, this is a systemic risk. And, you know, it's no longer a good to have thing. This is not, you know, like a good to capture kind of data or disclose data. This is what we are seeing right now is it is extremely material. So we're going to have, you know, how many more, you know, utility companies going bankrupt or many insurance or other companies going bankrupt is it going to take, right, for people to wake up, really. So because we are already seeing that in the data. We've already seen that happen, but we are seeing that, you know, so yeah, I'm excited by, you know, some of the partners, some of the early adopters we are seeing in the market because they are thinking about it the right way.
Yeah, I think I mean that's an important point on like regulatory mandates or accountability for the industry overall, right? So coming back to you, Nicole, what do you think needs to happen from here on for us to see a higher level of adoption for like climate financial risk disclosure or assessment even?
Look, I think a lot of the pieces are there. So I'm most familiar with the banking industry. Regulators globally, including in the US, are putting a lot of focus on physical and transition risk assessment and doing that well. Now, they don't know how to do it either, right? So it's not like we all know the answer and people just are not doing it, right? We're all building this together in terms of really understanding how to model and measure these things. So it's going to take time, but I do think the regulators are focusing on this, and you know, I think they should. You know, the goal is consistency of focus, right? Like, let's not drop this and start to think about other elements that matter for the financial system, because it is a systemic risk and it's only growing and it's kind of hidden. So I think that's a big piece. I think investors continue to play a role in asking the companies that they're investing in to provide this level of disclosure and information, right? I think those are two really important pieces of it.
Yeah. How about you, Anil? And anything else that you think would need to happen? Or?
I mean, I think when you are on the risk transfer side, right, so this all becomes real. Right. And there is an element of risk. Somebody is seeding, and if backing that, or you're engineering that risk transfer you're putting your capital at risk, right? So I think so this is one of those scenarios where I would expect to see faster adoption of some of these areas, regardless of what labels we apply. The impact is here and now, and then you start seeing that reflected in the pricing of some of these exchanges, and that's only going to be more sophisticated with the advent of more techniques, right? So clearly all the disclosure requirements and all of that would be super helpful, and they will all contribute to advancing it. And as Nicole said, this is an answer we're collectively sort of deriving as we go. But I think from a risk transfer vantage point, there is an immediacy. It needs to be factored in today, because that's what impacts the bottom line.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for all of your valuable insights. Abby, maybe we have some questions from the audience.
Hello, yes, we do have a question from the audience. Given the complexity of climate modeling and the rising cost of working with external service providers to interpret that risk, how do we democratize access to climate risks for individuals, small and mid-sized businesses, marginalized communities, et cetera? What role does the private sector have to play?
Ahmad, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I think we are seeing some of the FEMA maps, for instance, right, like being available to the broader public. Obviously, those maps don't seem to. I mean, they're two-dimensional, so obviously they don't capture some of these ripple effects. So I feel like people like discovery of risk and being aware of your risk is step one. And in fact, we are starting to see financial institutions, large financial institutions, and reinsurance companies being very open to making this data available to their customer base. Because quite frankly, they have their own incentives. They can basically then sell some financial products on top of it, but at least that gets the risk. We call it project data ubiquity within one concern. But it is an extremely important thing, because unless people are aware of this risk, that's bottom line. That's where it starts. And quite frankly, right now, we can't hide behind this thing saying like, oh, we couldn't capture this risk, the data is not there. No, we have consistent, comparable data to link physical risk and capture 90% of cash flow impact today because of climate risk to any business in the US. So we can't obviously say that the data is not available, and it's really digital, so you can get access to it. If a hedge fund can get access to it, then quite frankly, anyone should be able to get access to it. We obviously see on the other end of the spectrum, 40 to 60% of small businesses don't reopen after a disaster, right? We see, in fact, for the ones which open, 25% of them shut down after a year. So there is an outsized impact to marginalized communities. There is, we see, like it's kind of feeling like a bathtub with water. The bottom of the bathtub is the US power grid. So that's why you have like week-long, month-long power outages now. We didn't really have that 20 years back. That's climate risk for you. So then you keep filling it up, then you have the water system. Then you have the transportation networks. Then you have like, quite frankly, like the blue-collar workers in Houston, their homes, they get affected. Then way up is the corporate facility or the Fortune 500 facility. They don't get affected directly as much as the marginalized communities or the infrastructure. So I definitely feel like this could be a public-private initiative where we could come together and actually distribute this data more broadly.
Absolutely. Nicole, Anil?
Only thing, also totally agree. I do think it's more than a private sector problem for the reasons you're highlighting, right? Like there's some big public good problems we're also trying to solve, so we need to think about it more in a public-private vein. And then the other thing I'd say is like it's about the packaging of the information, right? Because a small business also isn't going to be doing a sophisticated analysis with like data dump, right? So it's more about, I think the opportunity for financial services providers is understanding you want to help your customer make better decisions, which is going to improve the risk profile of what you're doing with that customer, and how are you communicating it in the way that's going to be most consumable by that audience.
Wonderful.
In fact, just to add to Nicole's point, there was a day when we had metrics like, hey, you're telling a bagel shop owner, you are in a 500-year flood zone. What is the bagel shop owner supposed to do with it? They don't know whether to like cry, laugh, run away, sell their property, or just stay put. They're like, I'm not going to survive for 500 years, because they don't really know what it really means. But now you can tell them, that, hey, over the next 1 year, there's going to be 3 days of power outage and 10 days of no foot traffic. That's actionable information to literally that bagel shop owner or to any sort of financial asset tied to that hard asset. They can do something about it. They can mitigate it. They can probably put solar and a sustainable battery and mitigate that risk, right? And probably accelerate their net zero footprint. So essentially, there are ways to make it a win-win situation between the public and the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nicole and Ahmad touched on this, right? So as appealing as it sounds, access to all the data and an individual is not going to be able to tap in and do these sorts of analysis, right? Ultimately, it comes down to how do you enable these insights, and how do you provide actionable, mitigation measures, and that's only possible through private-public partnership. And I think that's where I would say most of the value is going to be in terms of driving this forward.
From your mouth to every central bank's ear. So, thank you, Nicole, Anil, Ahmad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Nazanin Ash, the CEO of Welcome.us, Gideon Maltz, CEO of the Tent Partnership for Refugees, and Asahi Pompey, Global Head of Corporate Engagement at Goldman Sachs, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Meg Szabo.
I hope you all aren't sick of me yet, because I know you've had a lot of me today, but at least today I brought this time I brought some guests with me, so. So obviously we're here to talk about tackling the migrant crisis and the role that corporations and companies can play in addressing it. So I will start with you, Asahi. Can you tell me, please, what do you see kind of as the role that corporations can play?
Sure. First of all, it's fantastic to be at Bloomberg and great to be here with amazing leaders like Naz and Gideon. So I'll start with a stat. In 2020, 281 million people lived in a country that was not their country of birth. By 2030, that's going to go to 350 million people. So while we're in a particular moment in time, the trajectory says that this is going to continue and accelerate. So as we think about the role of the private sector, it's a really relevant question, not only for today, but the years to come. I like to think about it as having sort of a bit of a four-part playbook in terms of what the private sector can do. One is, we all know if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. A partnership model is incredible, and we're great to have partners like Naz and Gideon. But here's what I would say. Number one of that playbook, corporations tend to think in terms of capital. And certainly, I worked for a bank for the last 18 years at Goldman Sachs. I think in terms of capital. And philanthropic capital is incredibly important, but it's not where the story ends. So part one, capital. Naz and Gideon would say, yes, capital. The second thing I would say around this is really expertise and know-how. being able to be nimble and dexterous to be able to respond to crises, I think, is particularly important, and sharing that expertise and know-how, I think, is a second role that the corporate sector can play. The third thing I'd say is technology and platforms. And I'll give you a specific example. We had and have an amazing collaboration with Welcome.us, where 2 engineers from Goldman Sachs, one Yuri, the other one Vadim, one a Ukrainian refugee from the 1990s, the other one a Russian refugee from the 1990s who came to the United States, helped to build the Welcome.us platform that's being used for refugees today. And so that goes to leveraging the people power of the private sector to work hand in hand with the nonprofits that are on the ground doing the work. Because while our intentions may be great, we may not have the expertise to know where's the capital needed, and having those great partnerships, I think, from a technology perspective is a great example. I think that's another one. So we've got capital, we've got jobs is the last one, right? And as we think about, where we can play a role, frankly, employing more refugees is one way in which we're able to move the needle as well. So I would say those are the things.
That's amazing. And I think everybody just heard Hamdi was obviously talking about that and the importance of hiring refugees. So it all works together very well. I will actually go to Welcome.us next for Nazanin to talk a little bit about how, a little bit about the partnership and how you guys have been working together.
Yes, I mean, you can see in this collaboration already how essential and integrated it's been with our private sector partners, and we couldn't be more grateful for innovators like Asahi and leaders like Goldman Sachs and the other leaders, including Hamdi, who are on our CEO Council, because just as Asahi's saying, we tap into those experts, we tap into those leaders for so many reasons, and I want to reinforce Asahi's playbook and build on it, right? Like, they are innovators with solutions that are, when we're addressing like some of the most difficult challenges, Asahi's laid out some of the stats. We have global trends in international displacement that are just growing, and they're going to continue to move in the wrong direction. They're powered by, enduring conflicts that have been really hard to resolve, but they're also powered by the unrelenting march of the climate crisis. And so these are trends that are going to be staying with us, and we need more solutions for more people to be able to migrate safely in an orderly way and in a productive way, and to be able to make their contributions in new communities. And the solutions for that have been well beyond the reach of governments alone. They're constrained by resources, they're constrained by expertise, and frankly, they're constrained by politics. And what's been so powerful about partnering with the private sector is, we've been able to work with the Biden administration on some unique solutions that allow more people in need of safety to come to the United States with the support of private sponsors. And this partnership between government innovation, the leadership of the private sector, and the generosity and compassion of our diverse American communities has resulted in the largest expansion in humanitarian pathways for people to be able to come here in safe and orderly supported ways in history, in US history. And it's a breakthrough solution for what's been a really difficult challenge, and it's been made possible by a partnership. You're hearing a lot from my microphone.
So what is the first thing that asylum seekers need when they come to the
Right.
US?
Right, so mostly they need more ways to come here safely and with the support upon arrival. But that support is the critical question you're asking. They've left not only businesses, homes, everything they've built behind, they've also left behind their family, their friends, their social capital networks. So what we find so important is not only coming to support in country, right? Like, who's going to provide that little bit of assistance for you to get back on your feet? What we know about the history of refugee integration in the United States is that it's been extraordinarily successful. Refugees have entrepreneurship rates that are 50% higher than native populations, right? Like, everywhere where they've resettled, the outcomes are only good. So, but they need a little bit of something to get back on their feet. What's so important about the sponsorship model is that it comes with almost a one-to-one case manager, right? So you've got someone who's meeting you at the airport. You've got somebody who's helping you find housing and navigate your community. Where's the best place to enroll your kids in school? Where's the best place to buy your groceries? where do I get halal meat? You know, so these are all the things that sponsors provide, which I find so like beautiful about it is it's both, you know, the basics, the, you know, housing and cash and temporary assistance and household supplies, but also a new social network, a new friend, a new guide when you need that sense of belonging and inclusion that research demonstrates is just as important to newcomer outcomes as, as the physical supports that they need on arrival.
So Gideon, turning to you, talking about the employment piece, can you talk a little bit about what Tent does and how you are helping refugees and other communities as they're coming to the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, not to boast, I think I have the easiest job in the world, not only because I report to Hamdi, who you heard from earlier, just an inspirational business leader, but because my job is going to large employers, almost all of whom face some sort of labor shortages. And we say to them, what if we could help you fill those labor gaps, fill them with a group of individuals who are some of the most motivated, dedicated individuals with demonstrably higher rates of retention and performance, that we can help you do that by sort of holding your hands, providing you resources, providing you guidance, that you can do that with pretty minimal investment on your side, that when you do so, you'll not only benefit on the workforce, but your other employees will feel more engaged, other potential employees will be more likely to want to work at your company. And if you communicate it correctly, the public will support it. And what if you can do all of that for free? And it's a very easy pitch. And so we've been able to mobilize hundreds of America's largest employers. Just in the last week, companies as diverse as McDonald's, Nokia, Estee Lauder have stepped up to join Tent. We now have well over 200 very large employers in the US alone. And so our pitch is actually trying to get beyond the charity, we really want companies to see this as a part of their talent strategy. We want them to understand that the companies that are most successful in recruiting and hiring refugees, that it's actually a competitive advantage for them. And we want them to see those business dividends so that it is sustained and it's scalable.
That's amazing. So you started to talk a little bit, Asahi, about the technology piece, but can you talk a little bit about when there is a disaster relief situation, how do you get the funding raised for a technology infrastructure that you need to address that?
Sure. I mean, I can think of, decades past where, corporations could think about just their financials. That time is no more. There isn't a crisis that unfolds anywhere around the world where I don't wake up and I don't have an email from several sectors. One is our employees that are saying, what is Goldman Sachs going to do? And I can imagine that that's happening at Walmart and JP Morgan and elsewhere.
Bloomberg. It does happen right here too.
Each of your corporations and entities. So you're getting it from the employee side. You're getting it from the region. Region heads are asking. You can sometimes get it from the CEO or CFO that says, what's your sense of what we should be doing here? We work with 9,500 nonprofits around the world, the nonprofit sector. So you can imagine when a disaster unfolds, my email box is overflowing. Now, to give you a sense of internally what happens, you think through any number of things, right? Because as much as people would like to think, I have infinite purse strings and I would love to have that, that's not the world in which I exist. And so I've got to make the case for $1 here that I choose to spend as president of the foundation is a dollar that's not going over there. And so I need to be stressing and I need to be worried about whether I'm making the right decision around putting it here versus there. And I've got to have all my facts lined up why I think this is the best deployment of our corporate funds in this particular area. And then I've got to go work on individuals internally to say, this is what I propose, I think we should do this. I think we should get our engineering team involved. I think our finance team should dedicate any number of hours. I think I'm going to fly over there. I think the head of our business should do that. So you've got a people response, you've got a donation response, you've got which orgs you're going to work with, and you've got ultimately what that number is. And all of that I've got to get crunched in a relatively short period of time to then leverage a response that's a response that we think works. So that's the day-to-day of what's happening. Maybe it's too much sausage making, but that's really what's happening.
No, it's what we want here at this event, so it's great.
And so the thing I would say is this. I never underestimate the reservoir of goodwill of our people, of Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg, all of your entities. You know, they want to not only say, well, what are you doing? But they want to say, how can I be helpful? And that's been incredible because I'll have, you know, any number of people that are saying, put me in. What do I need to do? And so that makes the sort of people aspect of it a little bit easier to do.
Yeah, wonderful. And yeah,
I mean, I think this point that Asahi is making is so important, and it's part of, again, why we've loved partnering with the private sector, because we want all of it, right? Like, we want the capital and the innovations and the solutions that the private sector brings, and we find the private sector to be such effective partners, not only in that like immediate kind of disaster response, what are the goods we need to deliver, but as visionary leaders on systems transformation. And Asahi, I'm never going to forget our first conversation where you were like, I see this vision, we're going to make this sponsorship model work, and it's going to be a solution for other populations that need assistance, you know, that need a pathway to safety, right? So I find the private sector so much more willing to like do systems transformation investments, to do innovative investments that allow us to try new things that can then come back and, you know, help transform and modernize our existing systems for service delivery or, you know, disaster response or migration. So it's such an important place to innovate. But the other thing is just as Asahi's describing, like, we want access to employees, to consumers. You know, she described Yuri and Vadim. One of my favorite stories is that their boss, you know, who leads engineering for Goldman Sachs, had to say, okay, thanks, no more. Like, we actually have day jobs, like too many people trying to volunteer on this project, you know? Like, it was really, you know, and it's turned into like such inspiration for Goldman employees, for ServiceNow employees, like to see your company showing up, like not just, you know, with this, not just, you know, for an immediate response, you know, to an immediate disaster, but part of this incredible long-term solution that is the solution to an intractable displacement challenge, you know? Like,
I've got to toot Naz's horn here, because originally what was conceived as a system to help Ukrainian refugees are now helping refugees from Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and any number of other countries. That's about the systemic change that you're driving.
Amazing. Can you share a little bit more, to go into the sausage making and a little bit more into the weeds, a little bit more about the platform, Welcome Connect platform, and what you guys have developed?
Yes, I mean, I'll share more, and Asahi can too. You know, the sponsorship program that was launched in partnership with the Biden administration allows people in crisis who need a bridge to safety to find it with the support of a sponsor. But importantly, they need to have a sponsor before they're able to come to the United States to safety. So our first initiative with Goldman was just to inform and empower our American communities to be able to sponsor individuals they knew. We're a beautiful country of diasporas, right? So there are so many diaspora communities, Americans who want to bring their loved ones to safety. We're also a community of do-gooders. So I think about returned Peace Corps volunteers, Partners in Health sponsoring so many of their former colleagues from Haiti, you know, so many other institutions, people who know people who need to be able to come to safety. And our first effort was just inform, equip, empower, get them the tools they need to be able to activate as sponsors. But as Asahi's describing, we very soon had so many Americans who said, I want to serve as a sponsor. I want to help solve this problem, but I don't know somebody who needs a sponsor. Can you help connect me? And at the same time, Yuri and Vadim were seeing, you know, vulnerable people in crisis looking for sponsors on places like Facebook, and that felt really dangerous to them. And that's why they came to us and they said, we know you're doing a partnership with Goldman. We're seeing this really dangerous thing happen. Is there something we can do together to create a safe and protected space for sponsors and people who need one to match? And that's what we did on Welcome Connect. And Goldman went out and collaborated with another private sector company, with ServiceNow, brought their expertise in. So their CEO is also now on our CEO Council. And it was this brought, cross-company collaboration that built a first-of-its-kind matching platform for sponsors and beneficiaries to connect. And it's safe, and it's protected, and it's led by, and this is the insight of Yuri and Vadim, who were themselves refugee newcomers. So they brought a sensitivity to it. We want people to feel empowered. We want people to feel safe. And so what I love about Welcome Connect is it's led by refugee choice. They choose their sponsors. But I also want to show you what it looks like. So this might be a good time to bring up the charts. So here, what we're showing here, Asahi see these maps way too many times. We're like addicted.
Never gets old.
So this is, we talked about how government systems are constrained. This is what our welcoming infrastructure looks like when you're relying only on government systems. And what I mean by that is public appropriations, right? We can't expect that Congress is going to double and triple or quadruple the amount of money that they dedicate to refugee resettlement, even as we know global displacement numbers are rising, right? And then these are the traditional government partners that receive public assistance to help welcome and resettle refugees. This system has been able to do, on average, 70,000 refugees on average each year for the last, that's the 30-year average, right? The 30-year average of what our government systems have been able to do each year is 70,000 refugees. I want to show you this next map. This is what has happened because we've let American communities participate in welcoming newcomers. This is the welcoming infrastructure that we have now. 360,000 individuals have arrived in the last 18 months to the support of a sponsor in the United States. And what you see is it's all over the map, and it leads to what's happening in New York, right? Like, this is distributed because sponsors are everywhere, and they come to support someone who's waiting for them at the airport.
It's amazing. It really is kind of mind-blowing, all of it.
I'm telling you, and it was private sector partners that built this systems transformation.
That's amazing.
That's what happens when you do these partnerships well.
That's great. So for the people in the audience, and this is kind of a question for everybody, before I do want to actually talk about what's happening in New York, because obviously we're here, and it's something that I think is very close to home. But before I do, just a question to all of you, because the people that we're talking to in this audience are practitioners that are working in sustainable businesses. What would your advice be to everybody here on how they could get involved, or they could convince their company to get involved in the partnerships that you're all working on?
Sure. I touched on this already, but I think for us, what we found the most enduring, sustainable partnerships for us are with the HR teams. We want companies to see this as a business proposition. It may start out of a humanitarian instinct, but to really get to scale, to really address this at scale, we want companies to be thinking about this as a talent acquisition strategy, and for them to then see the amazing dividends that it brings to their workforce, to other employees, and then potentially sort of other knock-on effects. And so for us, like, if you are inspired by what you can do, talk to us, but ultimately, we really want to be connected. We really want this to plug into your recruitment. And then the second aspect for us that we've been working with companies a lot on is professional mentorship, where we tap into employee resource groups at major companies and connect them with affiliated groups from the refugee population. And so we have a very active initiative where we're connecting members of veterans employee resource groups at major companies with Afghan refugees, because there's a unique bond that they developed in the Afghan theater. We're actually launching next week an initiative with Hispanic employee resource groups that will provide professional mentorship, one-on-one mentorship with Spanish-speaking refugees. And so tapping into employee resource groups, I would say for us, is the second way that companies can participate.
Amazing. So since we're almost out. Oh my goodness, we only have 5 minutes left. So I will turn to what's happening here, and we can start with you, Gideon, on just, can you talk about what you are doing with the current crisis here in New York and how you are working to employ the community here?
Yeah, absolutely. Just one thing before we talk about this, which is just when we talk about the crisis in New York, it's probably just worth having some perspective that, we're talking about 100,000 individuals who are in New York. And you look at a country like Colombia, which has absorbed well over 2 million Venezuelans, which has a GDP that is 1/10 of New York City, and that has done so with, I think, somewhat less drama than we've seen in the last week or two. So just for some perspective, it's a hugely important issue. We can do this. I think New York City can do this. So just in terms of drilling down, all the migrants who are in New York want to work. There's no shortage of employers and companies that want to employ them. There's essentially two roadblocks right now. One is, are they authorized to work? And the US government has invested heroic efforts in accelerating the work authorization process. So as we speak, a lot more are becoming authorized to work. And the second is, how do companies connect to them? Because the traditional infrastructure that Nazanin talked about, which relies on these sort of non-profit serving refugees, isn't really reaching them because of the way they're coming into the country. So there's also an issue of how we connect them to companies. And so at the request of the White House, my organization has stepped in the last few weeks to actually work in clinics to try to register these migrants in a database that we can then share with our major employers to allow those companies to assess, what are the skills matches, what are the needs, and reach out to connect them to employment.
That's amazing. And Asahi, maybe we'll turn to you. And what are you doing at Goldman right now, addressing this issue as well?
Sure. I want to pick up on something that Gideon said. I felt like coming out of the pandemic, there was this real embracing of our shared humanity. And I have to say that I worry that we've become a bit desensitized, we're becoming a little bit numb, we're becoming a little bit fatigued. And I feel like sort of reawakening that sense of our shared humanity is going to be particularly important to be able to galvanize the support that Nazanin, Gideon, all of us need around this particular issue. It's interesting because there's the saying, get proximate, right? The more you can get someone closer to an issue, the more you're going to engender greater empathy and goodwill, and on the back of that, then action. And so one of the things that we're doing, speaking of employers, is, and Naz will be at Goldman Sachs when we do this, we're having 20 Ukrainian refugees, actually 30 Ukrainian refugees, come to Goldman. We're having some senior folks across the firm meet with them for interview coaching around their resume. Why is that something that we're doing? Being able to sort of see our shared humanity, this person, their resume, frankly, wow, it's an amazing resume, super qualified individuals. They're just like someone I just left on the trading desk or I just worked with my banking deal on, is the kind of thing that I think allows us to be more sensitive back to our shared humanity. But I feel like that, and I don't know if others share that sense as well, that we need a bit of stirring that back up in this particular moment.
You're right.
Yes, we've had, that's been such an important, sort of underlying part of our mission in the sponsorship model, is because sponsors are so transformed by the experience because of their proximity. They're able to connect in a totally different way and be inspired in a totally different way, not only by the strength and resilience of the newcomers we're welcoming, but that we are a country that welcomes, right? It's this opportunity to reinforce the best of who we are and the best of our traditions, and people have been really inspired by that.
Last question for all of you. What do we tell all of these wonderful people in the room? What a call to action to them? How can they all get involved?
Well, I loved your question about how do you make the argument to leadership, right? The reason you make the argument to leadership, I think, is twofold. One, these are crises we can't ignore. If we don't find ways to productively and safely and well welcome newcomers, it poses huge humanitarian consequences, but also global economic, political, and insecurity challenges. I often say you can draw a line from the unmanaged Syrian refugee crisis to Brexit, right? These issues get weaponized in our politics, so we need productive solutions for them, and the private sector is bringing them. And the second reason is inspiration, right? Is like this opportunity to be involved. When people see companies leading and having transformational impact, we survey employees, and what they're telling us is we loved this opportunity to get up close with newcomers and see and be inspired by them. We loved that our company and that our leadership is doing this. We love being part of a company that is finding solutions to a global challenge. So my call to action is get involved. Come talk to me, come talk to Gideon, talk to Asahi. We've got a place to fit what your company contributions can be.
And we want to hear from you. I'm sure you're each doing various things in your own sphere that, I always want to leave a room smarter than I came into it. So I'm excited to know sort of what else, each of you are doing and to learn from that as well. And we can all innovate on that.
Amazing. Thank you all. Asahi, Gideon, Nazanin, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and to all of today's speakers and moderators. This is the end of our plenary main stage program. I would also like to thank our Summit Advisor, Principal Financial Group, for making this possible. To find any of these sessions after here, if you'd like to see them again, you can just go to bloomberglive.com and you can view on demand. And for our attendees here in New York, we do have our town hall session, which will be immediately following this. You can stick around. We'll have a panel of experts that you can just ask all of your questions to. So we encourage you to stick around. And then at 5 p.m., we will have our reception just right outside. So we'll see you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.